The war in Europe was almost over. By early May 1945, the Third Reich had collapsed in all but name. Berlin was falling to Soviet forces from the east, Allied armies were sweeping across Germany from the west, and Adolf Hitler was dead in his bunker beneath the ruins of a city that had once proclaimed itself the capital of a 1,000-year empire. Surrender was not a matter of if, but of when, measured now in hours rather than days. For most soldiers on both sides of the front lines, the overwhelming priority was simple survival, to endure just long enough to see the end, to avoid becoming the last man killed in a war that had already consumed tens of millions of lives. In that atmosphere of exhaustion and impending cessation, the notion of fighting felt almost absurd. And yet, in a remote corner of the Austrian Alps, in a medieval castle perched above a mountain valley, a battle was about to take place that defied every conventional logic of the war's final chapter. It was a battle in which American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops stood side by side, weapons aimed in the same direction, defending the same position against the same enemy. That enemy wore the same uniform as the Germans who had spent the previous 6 years fighting the Americans. They carried the same weapons. They spoke the same language. The difference in those final surreal hours was everything. Castle Itter sits in the Austrian Tyrol, a fairy tale fortress of stone towers and medieval walls that rises from a rocky promontory above the village of the same name. It looks like something from a children's book about knights and dragons, the kind of place that seems to belong to legend rather than history. But during the Second World War, Itter served a far grimmer purpose. The castle had been converted into a special prison, a detention facility for high-value French political and military prisoners, men and women whose symbolic importance to the Nazi regime was so significant that they were held not in ordinary camps, but in this isolated, fortified retreat. These were not ordinary detainees. Among the prisoners held at Castle Itter were some of the most prominent figures in 20th-century French public life. There was Paul Renaud, who had served as Prime Minister of France during the catastrophic summer of 1940, and who had actually lobbied to continue the fight even as German forces swept through the country. There was Maxime Weygand, a former commander-in-chief of the French army, elderly and imperious, a man who carried himself with the rigid bearing of a military aristocrat. There was Édouard Daladier, another former prime minister, the man who had sat across the table from Hitler and Mussolini at Munich in 1938 and signed the agreement that had handed Czechoslovakia to the Nazi regime in a futile attempt to purchase peace. There was Michel Gamelin, another senior military figure, and Jean Boratra, a celebrated tennis champion who had become something of a national hero in France. And there was Marie-Agnès Caillot, the sister of Charles de Gaulle, whose very existence in Nazi custody represented a kind of symbolic hostage-taking at the highest level. These people were, in the cold calculus of the Nazi state, potential bargaining chips, potential propaganda tools, were simply individuals whose continued survival or death might yet be made to serve some final desperate purpose. The man responsible for guarding them through the war's last weeks was an Austrian-born SS officer named Sebastian Wimmer. As the situation across Germany and Austria deteriorated, as Allied forces closed in from multiple directions, and the fiction of an organized German defense became increasingly untenable, the fate of the prisoners at Itter became deeply uncertain. Throughout the Nazi concentration and detention camp system, orders had gone out in the war's final phase that were monstrous in their clarity. Prisoners were to be executed before they could be liberated. The logic was the logic of a regime that had always preferred destruction to surrender, that would rather eliminate evidence of its crimes than allow that evidence to testify against it. Himmler's SS, even as the Reich crumbled, maintained its capacity for murder. The prisoners at Itter had reason to fear that their particular symbolic value, which had protected them through years of detention, might in the final days become the very reason for their execution. A liberated Paul Renaud or Edouard Daladier could speak to the world. A dead one could not. The broader SS presence in the Tyrol in those final days of April and early May 1945 represented something deeply dangerous. Fanatical units, untethered from any coherent command structure, ideologically committed to a cause that was already extinct in all practical terms, moved through the region with the unpredictability of cornered animals. These were men who had built their identities around the Nazi project so completely that its collapse threatened not just their military position, but their entire sense of meaning and purpose. Some of them responded to that collapse with attempts to negotiate survival. Others responded by intensifying their violence, as though killing more efficiently in the final hours might somehow redeem the cause, or simply because killing was the only language they had left. It was this second type of SS soldier, the true believer who would rather die in a final act of destruction than accept the world's verdict, who posed the most immediate threat to the prisoners at Castle Itter. Into this situation walked Captain John Lee, Jr., a 28-year-old officer commanding a small element of the American 12th Armored Division. Lee was not hunting for the castle or the prisoners it held. His unit was operating in the chaotic, fragmentary combat environment of Germany's final days, pushing through terrain that changed character hour by hour as the German military machine dissolved around them. Some German units were surrendering wholesale. Others were fighting with desperate ferocity. The front lines, to the extent that coherent front lines still existed, bore little resemblance to the organized military boundaries of earlier in the war. Lee was a capable and adaptable officer, operating in an environment that demanded exactly those qualities. When he encountered a Wehrmacht major named Josef Gangl, the meeting represented one of the most extraordinary confluences of the entire war. Gangl was a German artillery officer who had undergone a profound transformation in the final phase of the conflict. Having witnessed the full horror of the Nazi project on the Eastern Front, having seen what the regime he served was truly capable of, he had quietly shifted his loyalties. He had made contact with the Austrian resistance movement, a network of anti-Nazi Germans and Austrians who were working at enormous personal risk to facilitate a transition that minimized further bloodshed and sabotaged the regime's final destructive impulses. By the time he encountered Lee, Gangl was effectively operating as an intelligence asset and coordinator for the resistance while maintaining his Wehrmacht rank and uniform.
The war in Europe was almost over. By early May 1945, the Third Reich had collapsed in all but name. Berlin was falling to Soviet forces from the east. Allied armies were sweeping across Germany from the west, and Adolf Hitler was dead in his bunker beneath the ruins of a city that had once proclaimed itself the capital of a 1,000-year empire. Gangl brought Lee an extraordinary piece of information. There was a castle nearby holding high-value French prisoners. The prisoners were in danger from SS forces operating in the area, and there was a possibility, if action was taken quickly, of securing the castle and protecting its inhabitants before those SS forces could act. The proposal that emerged from this initial contact was, in the context of any conventional military logic, almost incomprehensible. Lee would take a small force, fewer than 15 American soldiers, along with Gangl and a group of Wehrmacht soldiers who had similarly broken with the regime, and together they would drive to Castle Itter, take up defensive positions, and protect the French prisoners. They would do this not merely in the proximity of German soldiers, but in active military cooperation with them, coordinating fields of fire, sharing ammunition, standing watch together through the night. The prisoners themselves added another layer of complexity to this already extraordinary situation. When Lee and his composite force arrived at the castle and the situation was explained, the French detainees, men who had spent years navigating the treacherous politics of wartime France, who had survived by their wits and their adaptability, grasped the reality of their position immediately. Some of them took up weapons themselves. Former prime ministers and decorated military commanders who had not held a rifle in years, who were elderly or weakened by years of detention, nevertheless positioned themselves at the castle's defensive points alongside the American and German soldiers. The tennis champion Jean Borotra would later describe standing at a window with a weapon, scanning the approaches for the enemy he never would have imagined standing against in this way. The surreal quality of the scene, French statesmen, American GIs, and German Wehrmacht soldiers sharing a fortified position against the SS, would have seemed like the invention of a novelist with no sense of plausibility if every detail had not been documented by multiple witnesses. The SS force that arrived in the early hours of May 5, 1945, was commanded by elements whose exact organizational identity remains somewhat unclear in the historical record, but whose intent was unmistakable. They came with firepower sufficient to overwhelm the small garrison Lee had assembled. They had armor, or at least the support of a tank, which represented a potentially decisive advantage against defenders holding a medieval castle with infantry weapons. The assault that followed was not a probing action or a demonstration of force designed to compel surrender. It was a direct attack, pressed with the urgency of men who understood at some level that time was running out, that every hour brought the Allied forces closer, that the window for executing whatever final purpose they had in mind was closing. The battle for Castle Itter was brief, but genuinely violent, fought in the gray light of an alpine morning, with the sounds of small arms fire echoing off stone walls that had stood for centuries. The defense held, but only barely, and only through moments that had the quality of pure contingency, the kind of moments that remind any serious student of history that outcomes are never as inevitable in their making as they appear in retrospect. Josef Gangl was killed during the fighting, shot by a sniper's bullet while shielding Paul Reynaud from fire. He died protecting a French politician from an assault conducted by fellow Germans, wearing a German uniform, having spent the last phase of his life working against the regime that uniform represented. His death in that particular moment, performing that particular act, carries a weight that transcends the merely personal. He became, in those final hours of the war in Europe, something that the Nazi project had always insisted was impossible. A German soldier whose ultimate loyalty was to human decency rather than national ideology. The relief that broke the siege came from an unlikely source, a Waffen-SS commander named Kurt Siegfried Schrader, who had himself broken with the fanatical remnants of his organization and made contact with the resistance network, helped coordinate the arrival of American reinforcements. The tank that had been brought to support the attacking SS force was destroyed. The attackers, faced with the prospect of reinforced American opposition and the certain knowledge that they were now acting in a context where German military authority had entirely collapsed, withdrew. The prisoners were secured. The battle was over. 3 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the Second World War in Europe came to its formal end. What happened at Castle Itter on May 5, 1945, resists easy categorization within the standard narratives of the Second World War. It was not a major battle in any conventional sense. The forces involved were tiny, the geographic stakes were local, and the outcome did not alter the war's trajectory by a single day. Germany was surrendering regardless of what happened on that Austrian hillside. The prisoners, in all probability, would have survived through liberation by Allied forces within days, even if Lee had never encountered Gangl and the castle had never been defended. In purely military strategic terms, the battle was a footnote, significant only to the individuals directly involved. But history does not derive its meaning solely from strategic significance. Some events matter not because they changed outcomes, but because they illuminate truths that larger narratives obscure or cannot contain. Castle Itter illuminates several such truths with unusual clarity. It shows the degree to which the final phase of the Second World War was not a clean binary confrontation between Allied good and Axis evil, but a vastly more complicated dissolution of authority, loyalty, and identity, in which individual human beings were forced to make choices that the previous 6 years of organized violence had made almost unthinkable. Josef Gangl had served the Wehrmacht faithfully through years of war. His transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but gradual, driven by accumulated witness, by the sight of things done in the name of the regime he served that he could not reconcile with any human standard of conduct. By the time he stood alongside American soldiers at Castle Itter, he had already crossed a line that many of his colleagues never found the courage or the clarity to approach. His story is a reminder that the categories that organize our understanding of historical conflicts, ally and enemy, perpetrator and resistor, are always, in practice, more permeable than the categories themselves suggest. The prisoners themselves added another dimension to this already extraordinary situation. Paul Reynaud had been prime minister during the fall of France, a catastrophe of such magnitude that it had defined the subsequent trajectory of French politics and identity for generations. Édouard Daladier carried the weight of Munich, of the compromise that had tried to purchase peace and instead purchased only time for a war that came anyway. These were men whose political careers had been shaped by their responses to the Nazi threat, men whose decisions in the late 1930s and the crisis summer of 1940 had become touchstones in debates about appeasement, resistance, and the limits of political will. To find them years later taking up weapons in a castle alongside American soldiers and German deserters was to encounter history in one of its genuinely unexpected configurations. Whatever judgments history might render on their political decisions, in those final hours they showed something unambiguous about their personal courage.
The war in Europe was almost over. By early May 1945, the Third Reich had collapsed in all but name. Berlin was falling to Soviet forces from the east. Allied armies were sweeping across Germany from the west, and Adolf Hitler was dead in his bunker beneath the ruins of a city that had once proclaimed itself the capital of a 1,000-year empire. The episode also speaks to something important about the nature of fanaticism in its terminal phase. The SS forces that attacked Castle Itter on May 5, 1945, were fighting for a cause that had already been destroyed. The man who had given that cause its animating ideology was dead. The government that had commanded their loyalty had ceased to function in any meaningful sense. The armies of which they were nominally a part were surrendering across a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Alps. They were, in the most literal possible sense, fighting for nothing, or rather, they were fighting for an abstraction, for an idea that had burned so deeply into their sense of self that its defeat felt indistinguishable from personal annihilation. This is what ideological totalism does to human beings. It colonizes identity so completely that the collapse of the ideology feels like the collapse of the self, and the response to that collapse can be indistinguishable from the response to an existential threat. Men who fight with nothing left to gain and nothing left to lose are among the most dangerous combatants in any conflict, and the final weeks of the Second World War were full of them. That John Lee made the choices he made to venture into ambiguous territory with an absurdly small force, to coordinate with German soldiers, to defend a castle full of French politicians against an SS assault, reflects something important about the qualities that distinguish effective military leadership from mere competence. Lee was not following a protocol.
There was no protocol for what he faced. He was exercising judgment in conditions of radical uncertainty, making alliances that no military manual had anticipated, taking risks that no reasonable cost-benefit analysis would have endorsed. The outcome vindicated those choices, but the choices had to be made before the outcome was known, in the gray uncertainty of a war that was ending but had not yet ended, where the difference between the last days of conflict and the first days of peace was still unclear. He trusted Gangl. He trusted his own assessment of a situation that defied every familiar category, and the prisoners at Castle Itter survived. The story of Castle Itter remained relatively obscure for decades after the war. It did not fit neatly into the triumphal narrative of Allied victory over fascism, with its clean lines of moral confrontation and its satisfying arc from darkness to liberation. It was too complicated for that story, too full of Germans who were also heroes, too full of political figures whose pre-war records made them imperfect emblems of resistance, too full of the kind of moral ambiguity that makes for difficult commemoration. The war produced many such stories, events and individuals who resisted the monuments and the cinema and the clean retrospective moral architecture that victorious societies build to make sense of what they have been through. History, when it is honest with itself, is always full of these resistant particulars, the details that will not be smoothed into the larger pattern, that insist on their own strange, irreducible specificity. The battle at Castle Itter, fought in the last hours of the most destructive war in human history, in an alliance that should have been impossible between men who had every reason to kill each other, is one of the most resistant particulars of all. What endures most powerfully about Castle Itter is not the tactical ingenuity of its defense, or even the remarkable improbability of its alliances. What endures is what it reveals about the human capacity for moral clarity in conditions specifically designed to destroy it. The Second World War was, among many other things, a sustained industrial effort to reduce human beings to their categorical identities, to make nationality and ideology and racial designation the only facts about a person that mattered. The Nazi project was built entirely on this reduction. And yet, in a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps, in the very last hours of that project's existence, a small group of men from different nations and different sides of the conflict looked at their situation and responded not with the logic the war had imposed on them, but with something older and more fundamental. They looked at who needed defending and who was doing the threatening, and they acted on that assessment, regardless of what their uniforms said about which side they were supposed to be on. Josef Gangl's grave is in Austria. He is remembered there with the quiet, complicated honor that belongs to those who chose conscience over allegiance at the moment when that choice cost everything. John Lee survived the war and lived for decades afterward, carrying with him the memory of those improbable hours. The French prisoners returned to a country that itself was struggling to construct an honest account of what it had been through, a country where the lines between collaboration and resistance, between accommodation and complicity, had been blurred beyond easy recovery, and where men like Renaud and Daladier occupied uncomfortable positions in a national memory that preferred its heroes unambiguous. None of them fit the monument. None of them belonged in the clean story. But that is precisely why their story matters, and why it continues to matter long after the last participant has gone. The wars that shape the modern world are never as simple as the stories told about them afterward. The courage that matters most is rarely the kind that arrives already knowing which side it is on. Sometimes it arrives confused, in an unfamiliar uniform, in an alliance no one planned, on the last possible morning before the peace, and it holds the line anyway. At Castle Itter, it did, and in that holding, something essentially human survived the very machinery that had spent 6 years trying to extinguish it.